Hi, everyone. This week, I'm joined by Kevin Heckart, the digital artist behind C-Punk's aesthetic, to discuss nut art.
Hi.
Joseph is currently in Copenhagen, so it's just going to be the two of us today. And this episode happens to coincide with the relaunch of the legendary C-Punk clothing line, Mainframe. The first half of this episode is going to be more of an interview with Kevin that will act as a spiritual threequel to Silent Generation's two prior C-Punk episodes. And then the second half will be more of a discussion on net art more broadly, where we discuss artists such as Brad Tromel, Hito Sterel, and Laturbo Avedon. So thank you for agreeing to do this, Kevin. You know, I started this podcast literally about a year ago. We recorded our first episode on October 22nd, and today is October 16th. And I had no idea I'd ever get to speak to you because you were one of my personal heroes in high school.
Oh, well, that's great to hear. I'm happy to be on here. I like what you're doing. I listened to a few of the episodes.
Thank you.
And I like how it is sort of based in Chicago, and you kind of just analyze different parts of history and also culture. So,
yeah, that actually is a good lead into the first question because I'm curious. So, could you let the audience know where you're from and where you live now? And also, have you ever lived in Chicago? Because I was pretty sure you did, but I wasn't able to confirm that in some proto research for this week's episode.
I wish I lived in Chicago. I visited Chicago a few times through my partner, and then also, I think we did a party, out of Pilsen. But I grew up in Kansas. I was born and raised in Wichita, Kansas, and some small towns outside of that. And I kind of rubbed arms with a lot of like musical creators, and I think even had like a small podcast where we kind of feature a lot of music and such. But I'm more or less kind of ingrained with the Midwest culture.
Yeah. Because I think both Ultra Demon and Zumbel, they both also lived in Kansas City. So did you meet them in person first, or did you meet them through the internet?
I wouldn't say I met them right off. I think I've never met Zumbel until I actually went up to Chicago for a party that we were doing. But I think I rubbed arms with Ultra Demon when we were doing these like underground parties called freakouts. But even before then, I had inadvertently ran into the band Josephine Collective at the Eagles Lodge when they were playing, and I had no idea who their keyboardist was. So that's kind of cool how later on I would run into them. We used to go up to Kansas City for these parties called Botnet. And I think I saw Ultra Demon play there a few times, even on like a Halloween set. That was kind of cool. And I had friends who were more musically inclined. I never really did any networking per se, but having friends that I did, having friends that networked for me. And a lot of the artwork I did when I met with them was just me sending them something and then them approving, So,
yeah. So would you say that, or which came first, would you say? C-Punk or your C-Punk art? Like, were you making the art that you did or you became famous for through C-Punk before you heard about the aesthetic, or did you start to make it after you heard about it?
Before, I think. I heard about this idea of C-Punk being this evolution of Witch House, and so I always sort of incorporate a little bit of Witch House like motifs even. So
like upside down crosses.
Yeah, the upside down crosses, sometimes like triangles or like very minimal imagery and symmetry, repetition. Yeah, that's kind of like a core feature of a lot of the artwork I did. So I started off with photography. I used to do model shoots and photo manipulations with, that incorporated symmetry and such. And then I got my associates in web development. So there was a big MySpace era and push at the time. So aside from that, I was also making my own little music projects along with friends with the dance party culture and an underground set of parties called Freakouts. And I would incorporate a lot of the photos we use there with a lot of the artists. And I would just either take some of the artwork they did and at the time, Photoshop had a really unique feature where you can put like 3D objects inside of something. And also at the time, I was doing, what is it, the flyers for a lot of the events we were doing. So I think a lot of that kind of just mix matched with some just stuff I would be sending for promotion. And yeah, and they liked it. And I guess the idea of C-Punk being a joke kind of played into that too. I think I overheard some friends talking at a party we were doing about this whole thing. It's like, hey, C-Punk is a thing. And so with that, I mean, I just kind of just tagged along with throwing in some ocean aesthetics. But C-Punk is actually the word cyberpunk, which we would refer to as the letter C. And then if it's misinterpreted, then they think it's ocean aesthetics. And that's where the little internet post sort of came from, where it's like, oh, so like barnacles where the studs would be.
I was actually talking to someone this week where I'd mentioned I was going to do this interview with you and that you'd created an aesthetic for this subculture called C-Punk, and they misinterpreted it like this week and thought it stood for cyber. And so, yeah, people are still conflating the two.
Yeah, and there are a lot of cyberpunk aesthetics in C-Punk. So, like, whether it be computers or little lines for connections, I usually try to incorporate like technology and tech into a lot of the works there. So you might see a computer screen, or yeah, and I'm not the sole arbiter of meaning of the C-Punk era, but I know there was a lot of gatekeeping at the time with what is and is not. But at some point, I don't see myself as like some authority to make that value judgment. So
Yeah. And I found a TikTok video where you described yourself as having invented the visual aesthetic behind C-Punk / Vaporwave. And so your involvement with C-Punk has been established and well documented. But where do you think your work fits into the history of Vaporwave?
Vaporwave, I mean, I use the term pioneer very specifically because being a pioneer, you're charting your own path, and that path may parallel with other scenes. So, my path, maybe covers some vaporwave. Being that I'm not the sole arbiter of vaporwave, thus is much internet art. When you create a post, someone could take that post and assign their own meaning to it. And Twitter, they call this thing called ratioing, where they could take a criticism and then highlight someone else's original post, and maybe it gets more viral than the original post. So,
Yeah.
like that, I think there's, you could call a work of mine vaporwave, but do I really control that, or do I, I guess I could say I do assign vaporwave to a lot of the works because it is similar to what I would see as vaporwave, which is those tiles that you see from the what's that really common album with what's that artist name?
It should be coming to me because we did a Vaporwave episode, actually, which I was going to mention because we did a section where we looked at Vaporwave art and then sort of analyzed the different elements. And when I thought about it more critically, I realized that the way that most Vaporwave art is composed seems to be referencing the way you composed your C-Punk artwork. And there's an inexplicable amount of dolphins in Vaporwave art for absolutely no reason. And I think that's a cue that, you might be where they got their inspiration. Because dolphins have nothing to do with the 1980s, really.
Yeah, I think it's more or less not the dolphins in themselves, but the synthetic. The dolphins do not look organic or hyper real. So they almost look like the dolphins you would see on a textbook from like the 90s, or that test image that you see with the primitive objects. There's a type of anti-hyper realness to the C-Punk era, where you look at like the graphics of Myst, or the graphics behind the CGI behind that show Reboot, and it's this like blend kind of anti-compressed texture shine that comes back. And I think that is very similar to Hito Starrell's like the critique on the low res image. It sees itself in relation to the high res image as something separate from that, and maybe a reaction to it. So
Yeah. The show Reboot too is actually something that I'd sort of missed in, my big C-Punk slideshow and prior to the C-Punk episode that I did for Silent Generation. Like, I'd heard of other main inspirations behind the C-Punk aesthetic, and the big one being Echo the Dolphin. But could you talk about Reboot a bit? Because I've never actually watched the show.
I don't know the show. I mean, I did watch maybe an episode when I was like a kid, but I wouldn't know anything narratively, but I do know the aesthetics of the show, very similar to like Transformers Beast Wars. And
oh yeah.
Even with the Transformers Beast Wars, there was an episode where they all had this power surge and they all had like this really shiny armor afterwards, like as it was like a molding into a new show. I always thought that armor was so cool looking, like it kind of addressed my sense for like or a subconscious sense for stimuli that's vibrant, and because that's me probably chasing my own attention deficit. And that's a lot of my art, where you see a lot of vibrance, shininess, and maybe it's just me chasing my own my attention span even.
Yeah. And that's a good way to think about it too, because the general definition I give for the term aesthetic, which in the context of internet subcultures is a very important word, but the definition I give is that it's anything that's still visually stimulating in the digital era, because we're so inundated with images that most things don't seem special or beautiful or interesting. And so when you do find images that do actually evoke something or anything at all, they're very cherished, and that's what Tumblr really was about. But yeah, you're looking at it a bit differently in terms of like ADHD, but yeah, seems like a similar idea. But yeah, how would you define aesthetic as a term?
Aesthetic, I maybe there's two definitions. Maybe there's the when you see the hashtag aesthetic, you see something that's at home in the terms of being on Tumblr, and seeing something minimal with a plane. But aesthetic also in the art term is the situation or the mezzanine scene, a background even, or the material conditions of someone who's living under a specific class or structure. So
yeah, the way that like aesthetic gets used in academia, when I was in college studying visual and critical studies in undergrad, I would read so many essays that would talk about aesthetics. Like, for example, in 3 essays on accelerationism, there's a chapter on accelerationist aesthetics. And I couldn't divorce my definition of aesthetic coming from Tumblr and actually like read those texts and fully get what they were talking about, because it had such like a strong association for me. But yeah, there are different ways it's been used, but I think it's good to define it in terms of what it meant during the Tumblr and C-Punk era. But another question I wanted to ask is, what 3D modeling programs did you use to make your C-Punk artwork back in the day? And did you use any different programs when you made the artwork for the new Mainframe shirts? Because we're going to get to those in a moment. As part of the relaunch of Mainframe, I believe you have a few new designs, right?
Yeah, I have one new design, and then the other two, since I didn't have the files, I did lose the files. I basically had to recreate based on doing my best effort as far as the original files and stuff. So it's kind of cool because I can relook at my art and see where I went. And that's kind of a lot of my practice, even when I was going through art school, because I didn't actually have any sort of formal art or understanding of critique even when I was making the art back in like 2012. It was later on that I guess I'd make all this art and just send it off. I had no idea what a statement was. I would just be posting it on Tumblr or sending it to my partners at Coral. And I had no idea what like a release process was or practice behind it was. And then later on, my partner, who did go to art school, would like be mentioning all this stuff and this post-internet theory stuff. And I'm like, cool, maybe I should just go to art school to learn this. And so in my 30s, back in 2017, I decided just to go to art school to see what it was about. And I did learn a lot about the stuff that would be referred to as art speak and understanding the practice behind and the history behind a lot of the art too. So I could describe it differently and talk about it using, philosophically loaded jargon. But then again, I do see a lot of that stuff and I can understand it differently, but I definitely will try to speak to a language that meets everyone who doesn't spend, $70K on an art degree. So
Actually, Brad Trommel just came out with a new culture report on art schools, which I haven't watched yet. But are you still happy with your decision to go to art school, or how did that go for you?
I learned a lot as far as like being able to talk, and I think it is about the networks that you make too in the school.
Yeah, for sure.
I definitely don't regret it, but I definitely kind of second guess it every time I make a payment. So
Yeah. But back to the question, because I don't know if you mentioned it or if I didn't catch it, but what 3D modeling programs did you use for your CPunk artwork?
Yeah, the 3D art programs. I use a program called Carrera. That's more because it has like a shader, a system that allows for the kind of the synthetic look behind, like you see a lot of the mist textures and stuff in there. So it is kind of an older program. But when it comes to modeling in general, I use a program called Maya because I pirated Lydia tutorials to learn how to use it. Yeah, so aside from that, it's just I use different programs to model. But when I first was starting out, I had no idea how the 3D models. So a lot of my early works will just show kind of just a photo manipulation of 3D models and like the orbs and just a lot of primitive models in there. And it wasn't necessarily, I mean, it was intentional to put that stuff in there, but because I did like the shapes and the minimal aspect of like having orbs and bubbles, but it wasn't necessarily, what is it?
Yeah, I mean, like you later made more complex works, but your earliest ones, like they do have those bubbles and spheres.
Yeah, and I don't know if I had a real intention behind a lot of that stuff. I mean, with the 3D dolphins, I mean, I would be cutting them out of other artworks at the beginning, but then later on, I was making my own models. So,
yeah, it's interesting to learn about the 3D modeling programs that you use because I'm actually a librarian with a bit of a specialty in makerspaces. So I know a lot about 3D printing and 3D modeling. And I actually had written a question for you about digital preservation because I wanted to know if you had access to your original CPunk designs and the files, but turns out you don't. And I was interested in that in part because I got a master's in library and information science. And as part of that, I learned about digital preservation, which sounds a little bit boring, like I might just be USB drives and learning how to save things over the cloud, but it's actually very much a science and it takes a lot of thought and work to migrate a bunch of file formats and keep things on a retention schedule and make sure that you don't lose access to files over time. Because within the library and information science world, like most archivists would much rather have physical documents to store in a box in a room than have files that they have to continuously work on, because they have to take a much more hands-on role with the digital file formats because they've been evolving so much over the past few decades. And it's actually argued within the digital preservation world that there are a few file formats that will never become obsolete now, like JPEGs, but most of them think that all of them eventually will. And it's not guaranteed that we continue to have the necessary ways to interpret said files. But yeah, it's too bad that you lost access to those. But how close would you say you were able to replicate your original CPunk artworks for the mainframe shirts?
I had access to some original images and then also the shirts themselves. So I would say, I wouldn't put a number on it, but I would say probably at least 80% looks pretty much the same. I also had And maybe they didn't need to be the same because, the updated version of it seemed a lot better too. So we could work on the colors. But yeah, you do
Yeah.
talk about the preservation of things. I did have a Dropbox at the time, but I think it was linked to an old community college account. So I don't have access to that email anymore. But regardless, I did have like a hard drive failure at some point. And so backing things up on a server where there's like a RAID set up, it was definitely ideal in digital preservation. And there have been times I've had to use a program to go through deleted sections of a hard drive to see if I could find anything, pertinent to my art. And it's probably not the best practice, but at the time I didn't really have any sort of art understanding of it. It was more or less just someone making $9 an hour on a computer, an e-machines computer that's really low in tech, just trying to put out works. So, but now that I have the means of creating art and even the technology to back it, I definitely do practice a lot better preservation.
Yeah. Even with my podcast, I've thought in it ahead a bit about like how to make sure that we don't lose access to the files in some worst case scenario. Like I've thought about copying all of our episodes onto like discs of some sort, but another approach that you can take is actually just redundancy. Like we have all of our episodes, for the most part, we actually fell behind a little bit, but posted on YouTube. And that's just like an extra place to store them so that in worst case scenario, we can download them again. But yeah, back to the reason for today's episode. So what made you want to relaunch Mainframe?
My reason of hitting up Mainframe is, it's my reintroduction of the art. Or I could relook at my own art through the lens of the actual formal training I've had in art school and maybe just try to regrasp meaning from it. But aside from that, I don't know. I think it was Zombell that hit me up for the t-shirts, and since they're relaunching, I'm more than happy to kind of share my design over to that. So will C-Punk ever come back? I don't know. That's not. I'll put out the art, but I don't think.
Yeah,
I could be optimistic toward it.
From my perspective, it kind of seems like there's one last living C-Punk, Prefoco 21. Have you connected with them over Instagram?
I have not. I have seen their posts. It's cool that there's archivists. I think there's also someone on TikTok that's called the C-Punk Historian, which I'm not sure if they're aware of that, but they do talk about music a lot. So
yeah, hopefully it comes back around. I'd mentioned on actually the C-Punk 1 episode 12 of Silent Generation, that I teach at a nonprofit foundation, and I had a student in a class that was both dressed very aquatic and then was also making like, it was a 3D printed jewelry class, and they were making like seashell and coral 3D printed jewelry. And I was like, do you know what C-Punk is? And they were like, yes. And we were both a little bit confused, I think, because we were like, how do you know about this? But they'd never actually heard like any C-Punk music. They'd never seen any C-Punk music videos. And I've like sort of looked around TikTok to try and see if that was maybe how like someone who's 12 years old found out about it, but I'm not sure where they got the news from. So yeah, it could be that there's untapped C-Punk people out there that we're just not aware of, but I think your clothing line might reach a big audience, because I didn't actually know this before I started researching for this week's episode, but you actually have like 1.1 million TikTok followers, which is actually wild.
Yeah, and not even because of the C-Punk art. That was something totally different. I like to hack a lot of different animatronic things, and I got one to work with Alexa, and I started making these animatronic fish, and they kind of blew up. It's weird because like the stuff that you don't really work on too much kind of becomes its own thing, and then since they liked it, I kept on doing it. So
yeah, I think it's kind of interesting that you're more famous now for hacking Billy Mouth Bass singing fish than creating C-Punk. It kind of makes me think of the dinosaur chicken nugget meme, and yet a trace of the true self exists in the false self, because you're doing something that is a little bit C-punk still with fish, but people don't know about your previous life.
Yeah, or some sort of 90s symbol or nostalgic symbol even, because the Jemmy fish had been around for quite a while, and it kind of was a novelty for many people. My thesis was originally a thing called Dreams in the Wire, where I created this interactive light fixture that follows the user as they move around, and that was using the same technology I have with synchronizing music and lights with the music. So I was just using that same technology I was developing in my thesis to direct, instead of a light with music, motors to music. So yeah, using a little teensy microcontroller, Ableton Live to send the MIDI signals to the controller, which is based on the inputs from Ableton. So
Yep.
and being able to cue that up with some sort of IoT based system, like, or the AI system of Alexa. So who knows, like a lot of it was, I think maybe that picked up on the algorithm for that was the fact that when I say the word Alexa, it triggers their actual device too. So who knows if that had any play to people responding to it.
Yeah. I don't have an Alexa in my house. I always think about the meme, like about like how 1990s parents wouldn't let you even put your real name on the internet, but then they all have like wiretaps in their house now. But yeah, in all seriousness though, we've done several episodes on internet aesthetics, and we've looked into like the OG creators of a bunch of different subcultures and what they're up to now. And there often is a similarity between the lives they're living today and the movements that they were involved with in the past. And I mean, Shan, Zambel is even a good example of this too, because they created this like tropical aesthetic, and now they live in the tropics in Costa Rica. And when we looked at health goth, a lot of the people involved in health goth, like two of them work in healthcare. Another one now owns like a racquetball company. Like they're still involved in health and fitness. And it's interesting to like learn what people are doing. From an outside perspective, from mine, it still seems like you are still trying to materialize the digital world, albeit in a very different way than you were previously.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say it correlates to my like day job necessarily, but it might string together with a lot of the practice that I do now. But that's definitely something that could be related to this like intuition of one direct medium.
Yeah, cool. So I think a good place to start discussing net art would be with Brad Trommel's idea that the net art that is exhibited in galleries and museums is typically work about the internet that subtly references it, rather than work that is from or for the internet. And this is an idea that I think he had posted as Instagram posts, but he puts out so much content that I was able to find a few things that I can link in the show notes that he's done that we'll reference throughout the episode. But this one wasn't one of them. Because he has so many posts, and it would have been impossible for me to figure out where he'd shared this idea. But he brought this up in reference to how like memes have more cultural impact than paintings, but they aren't taken seriously as works of art, which Brad has been a vocal critic of, as he's fully embraced memes as an art form. And a good example being how his Joe Biden, his brain, know his heart meme went so viral in 2020 that social media sites actually removed it from their platforms for being fake news.
Yeah, it's hard to look at his posts sometimes as like not authentic. I know there's a lot of political commentary nowadays that are like even with like the hats that people wear with like the AmeriCorps collections that they have, where now the regular the leftist is wearing the political chud hat of like the camouflage stuff. But anytime I see a Brad Trammell link or some sort of meme on at least his Instagram, I definitely think it's definitely satire, because and it's funny too. I really enjoy his his art on there.
Yeah. That makes me think of this thing Ken Klippenstein once said where he was discussing other like people in the online media sphere, and he said basically like how can you say, you know, how authentically someone feels something in their hearts, because we oftentimes say someone's a grifter or they're a troll, but you really never know actually how authentic someone's being. And with him, he's definitely trying to be funny. He definitely is funny. But it's hard to know how serious he is sometimes. Back to that idea of his about how, like, you know, there is work in museums that does have to do with the internet, but it's not really exemplary of what's actually going on the internet when there's actually so many images and so much artwork being generated and shared through that space. And then what ends up in museums just seems kind of mid and random. Like a good example of this for me is the work of Laura Owens, who's a painter. I'm going to link painting in the show notes, but I think I've seen her work at MoMA, SF MoMA, the Art Institute, and the MCA. So her paintings are all over major museums, and they combine traditional oil paint with screen printed images that were digitally manipulated in Adobe Photoshop. And so you see like very little references to layers and PNGs. Like I oftentimes have noticed these tiny checkerboard patterns that indicate that, but her works kind of pay homage to Photoshop, but there's really nothing online about them. Like she doesn't read as a digital native. She doesn't seem to interact with online communities, but she's firmly an established member of the fine arts world. But I don't think her paintings are more evocative or stimulating than the average meme you find online. And so I think she's a good example of that, of just how the work that's supposed to be at the internet that does end up in our world kind of isn't the best work that's out there.
You know, it makes me wonder who's organizing the art world. You know, are there foundations, and are the heads of those foundations considering like what's going on online? You know, or is there old media? I refer to it as old media because any artwork that's considered online is usually new media, and maybe with that the connotations behind that are that, you know, they don't necessarily belong in a gallery representation. But yeah, definitely brings up some questions there. So
Yeah. And on like who's getting to pick, it makes me think about Brad Tromel's post-internet report, which I'd watched in preparation for this episode, because he brought up that the point at which gallerists, collectors, people in the art world started to really engage with social media as part of the art market was around 2011, because that's when the iPhone cameras became high definition enough that they could sufficiently show artworks in good enough detail that they could be sold online. And so at that point, all of the people who were in charge of like high-end galleries, they realized that if they weren't able to start to market and sell work online, that they were going to start to fall behind and lose money. So they picked it up. But I mean, back to Laura Owens, I mean, I feel like I can actually see why people would buy her work and why they're as expensive as they are, because they're large. Like I feel like literally everyone I've ever seen is like floor to ceiling. They are well executed and they're clearly expensive, but there's just something missing. But that's not to say that like people who come from the online sphere are not ever invited into the fine arts world. A good example is actually Molly Soda, which I assume you're familiar with because she was a proto e-girl that was really popular on Tumblr.
I knew who Molly Soda was. I didn't know that Zombell like hung out with Molly Soda. That was impressive. I actually heard that from the podcast. But yeah, I knew who that was, and I saw a lot of their posts online. And I see what they're doing now too, which is kind of cool, just kind of getting their own representation and progressing into more of I guess they're hosting their own spaces too. So
Yeah, because there's that famous basement photo where there's Zumbel, Ultra Demon, Grimes, a few other people, including Molly Soda. So she's in that really famous photo. But like post Tumblr, she's now kind of a blue chip artist, very successful. And she's been fully invited to join conventional institutions and become an insider, which is something that Brad Tromel also brought up in his post-internet report, is that the reward for being like someone who's authentic and someone who represents alternative scenes is to then become part of the mainstream. That's the reward that you get. But once you're expected to start pumping out artworks to sell to collectors and you don't have the ability to engage with the cultural discourse of the internet anymore, your work stops evolving. And so it just starts to become dull and self-referential. And Brad goes on towards the end of the video to say, like, that's why he went in the direction he did, where he opted to become like a Patreon-funded meme creator rather than just like a conventional contemporary artist, because he very much could have been. We'll get to that later, but like he does have very high-end studio work that he was selling for presumably a lot of money.
I definitely agree that he could have maybe gone to do that. I remember he had an auction for was it a sealed up taco that had like a lock that was inside of it, and I just thought, how are you going to distribute that?
Yeah, I've read about that piece where like he'd created a series of artworks where it wasn't necessarily about the taco and the lock. I mean, that wasn't necessarily the art. The art was actually trying to figure out how to like transport it.
Yeah.
Like the conversation around that is what the true artwork was.
Exactly. And that's exactly what I got from that. So, but I think when I see an artwork in a blue chip gallery in New York, I think that the only person who can probably buy that piece of art is someone who actually has a place to put the art in New York, considering the rent, and or ownership of it. So I guess art for people who can't afford it or use it as a tax deduction or buy 12 pieces to speculate the market to make more money. Art is a commodity in that respect, and much like real estate. So I guess it is what it is in that respect. So
yeah, I mean, there's a reason why like painting has stayed so popular, even though it is, painters won't like me saying this. I mean, there's no reason for it to still be the most popular medium. I think there's better mediums out there, but it's still so popular because it's easy to put in your home. And then also as an artist, it is easier to do that than to work in a medium that requires a lot of equipment, like say ceramics or metalworking. But one other aside I want to bring up briefly is just that activist art, I think, occupies a similar place in the art world that net art does. And activist art is also very grassroots and vernacular. And the art world will frequently open up its walls to activist artists and let them join in. Like, there's a very good article I'm going to link in the show notes for people who are interested called Trojan Horses, Activist Art and Power by Lucy R. Lepard that kind of goes through this. But I want to bring up an aside too. One of my professors when I was at SAIC, because I also went to art school, they once lamented to me that they were kind of annoyed because seemingly every artist in Chicago made art that had like an activist or political angle. And she felt like everything she saw was trying to like solve like some sort of massive social issue. And she remarked that like in other art scenes, like particularly NYC, artists don't feel the same pressure. And they're able to sort of make art that's purely creative and doesn't have this activist angle. And I think like a good example of a local artist who kind of does do this from an activist angle is Amanda Williams. Have you ever heard about them and their work?
No, I haven't. I'd like to know a little bit more.
Yeah, so she's most famous for the series of photographs she did called Colored Theory, where she painted dilapidated homes on Chicago's South Side, really vibrant colors that reference Black culture. Like one of the houses, she painted the color of like hot Cheetos. And then they became these really bright structures prior to their demolition. And I do like her work a lot, but I do think it represents sort of how Chicago artists sort of try to get the attention of like coastal art scenes, because they really don't pay attention to what's going on here. The art scene here is really centered around SAIC, to the point that one time I went to like this open house for like, what do you call it? Sorry, the word's not coming to me, but someone had put on their wall, they'd put like their name is a local Chicago artist not affiliated with SAIC. Because the art scene here is like so centered around one institution. But I have some friends who I went to art school with who worked for galleries in NYC and then later went to work for galleries in LA, who said that they were kind of dismayed to see how little coastal art scenes actually care about what's going on in Chicago. And it does sort of seem like if you didn't go to art school, if you're not like a professionally trained artist, there are sort of two avenues that you can enter in the scene. One being net art, the other activist art. So that was the big point I was trying to make. Sorry for the tangent.
Oh, no, it's fine. Exactly. Like I was making net art way before I even went to art school and understood all the big art speak words. So when I started art school, my first thing to think was to be a political or activist. But when people are just talking about their lives, the personal can be political too. So yeah, there's this need to relay to your surroundings as an artist. I think I know I did when I was like probably my sophomore year. I wanted to like tie it, and a lot of times it's because after 2016 people were really riled up. That's when I was in school. So, and honestly, if you had anyone around you that said, "Oh, I don't pay attention to politics," it was something felt very privileged to say in circles.
Yeah, because I was in art school around the same time from like 2014 to 2018. That was post-Trump's election.
Yes.
And people were very riled up. So there were a lot of conversations about politics happening.
Yeah, I follow a political commentator on Twitch who talks about politics in the news. And it's the way I absorb a lot of the news and like kind of in bite-sized chunks that I can understand and not have to do a bunch of reading because, I do work 40 hours a week and don't have time to read like a 20-page dissertation on specific issues. So getting it kind of and maybe that's a critique in itself, being that like we need to make art for the people who do have to work all those hours and not like have time to appreciate art or a good critique. So I do follow like a lot of just kind of new media based commentary.
Yeah, for me, my main political source is Breaking Points. They're actually the podcast I listen to the most because they put out so much content each week. But yeah, what's the Twitch streamer that you follow?
Hassan Piker.
Oh yeah, I'm familiar with him. So I want to address this. So why did I pick the name Net Art for this episode? Because we could have gone with something else, like maybe post-internet or internet art. I actually picked it because it subtly rhymes with your name. So Net Art with Kevin Heckart.
Oh, that makes sense. That's pretty funny.
Yeah. But yeah, the next section is like, what is net art? Because net art generally refers to works of art that were made to be circulated on or interacted with through the internet. I'll put in the show notes a link to Rhizome's Net Art Anthology, which is a list of 100 solid examples of net art. And you'll find that most of them are actually like websites that people had created. My favorite one being Olia Lia Lina's My Boyfriend Came Back from the War. But in terms of accuracy, like, why didn't we pick post-internet? How do you feel about post-internet as a term and just as an aesthetic, Kevin?
Post-internet's great. I first heard of post-internet through my partner who went to art school, and I'm like, okay, that sounds cool. I saw a book on it. I'm like, okay, so that's like what, meme art? Like what are words besides their fractured meanings, Like if you use a word and you have an intention behind a word, you could use it. So that's my idea. Like, you could use net art or post-internet art as long as if you have a meaning that circles someone else's meaning bubble.
Yeah, I first was sort of introduced to the term myself in art school, probably around 2016 or 2017, which was several years after I'd have been exposed to like online art and Tumblr art and that whole world. And I didn't really like it at first. And to me, this term, I mostly use it in reference to Dis Magazine, which they were really great, but to me, there's like a separate post-internet aesthetic that I can separate from net art more broadly. When I think about Dis Magazine, my favorite photo shoot is actually the photo shoot they did with Madison Beer. Have you heard of her before?
I have not. No.
Yeah, so she was like, Justin Bieber made her famous because he brought attention to some like YouTube cover she did like many years ago. And so Dis Magazine did a photo shoot with her back in the day when she was like a fledgling famous person who might not have had the career that she has today. Because in the years since, she actually has like two like top 100 albums. I don't feel like I've ever heard a song by her, but she's become famous enough that she has like 39 million Instagram followers. But the photo shoot that they did with like this magazine is just so like incredibly bizarre. Like in one of the pictures, she has like a pet cactus on a leash. In another one, she's surrounded by like 20 soda things from like 7-Eleven. And it really like captures the sort of like unsettling mood that I associate with like Disc Magazine and post internet.
Yeah.
Do you have any like favorite like Disc Magazine projects that come to mind?
No, but I mean, it definitely seems like they're kind of circling like post internet with like the disregard of intention behind art, or specific, like if it's different regardless of its meaning or any sort of meaning at all, like it could be considered internet art. But then again, I'm not sure why that they would do that. But and then again, it's the internet, so
Yeah. Yeah, I feel like net art is a bit more like earnest, you know, all of those like early 1990s websites that artists had created. Like they were trying to make net art into something that could be serious. They wanted to be taken seriously. But then by the time like the term post-internet came around in 2006 and this magazine came out, I don't think net artists who work through the internet, they didn't have to fight to be seen as serious in the same way that like prior generations had. So yeah, there is this sort of like humor and irony that comes across in a lot of like the work that came out of Disc Magazine.
like in Hito Starrell's Factory of the Sun, it's almost like they recreate the video of someone going like almost viral with like a specific almost prediction of the TikTok dances that you would see, which I thought was really interesting.
Yeah. I'm excited to talk about those dances. We could probably save that for a little
Oh,
bit
yeah.
farther down when we get to her work. But yeah, I think that like in general, art theorists, they get really excited about the inherent qualities of different mediums. Kevin, what do you think are like the qualities of net art? Like, you know, for example, photography is documentation, print media is repetition, sculpture has anthropomorphism. Like the different mediums, they do have these like intrinsic things that are kind of the best to explore in those given mediums. And what do you think like net art has?
It probably references like anything with like the age at which it exists. So I mean, the fact that it's like a GIF, like if it's animation based or repetition animation based, that could be it. So when you see like a work by Lorna Mills or something, and they're like their Clusterfuck Zoo, that's the name of it. You know, you'll see repetition of animals through collaboration too. Collaboration is also a big motif with because there's people who live billions, or not billions, but like thousands of miles away, all putting together a piece to something that's unified and put a name on and an idea behind. And also like maybe that references the technology or age that they're in. So like it doesn't necessarily have to have a specific visual requirement necessarily, but more or less it's maybe the process over the product. So
Yeah, it's interesting that you bring that up because you see the sort of like connection that net art has to the present as being a benefit, because apparently like prior to the terms net artist and post-internet, new media artist was the term that was used for people who kind of did anything outside of traditional mediums, including like stuff with TVs and early computers. But they actually, like, people didn't consider their artwork as serious because they thought it was doomed to look dated. But I agree that there is something nice about artwork that does start to kind of look bound in a particular time, because I think it gains more meaning, you know, like a bit unrelated, but with, say, documentary photography that's made in the present day always looks a bit boring because it looks every day, but then it becomes so much more meaningful as time progresses. And maybe net art is like that too, where it might look a little bit more commonplace today, but it looks a lot more representative of a time period as time goes on.
yeah, like I guess, for example, when you look at some of the vaporwave works or, C-punk works, you'll see the UI representation of like a Windows screen, and that maybe
Yeah.
can convey some sort of memory that someone had over, AOL Instant Messenger with talking with their friends while listening to music. And that was like maybe a time that kind of shows some sort of, it kind of shows like a epoch for like, what went on during that time for a lot of people. So,
Yeah. Also, I just noticed that I have the docket open. I bet you do too, but I can see that you're looking at it and it says you're anonymous dolphin.
oh, really? That's funny.
Yeah, as like a C-punk reference. That's a nice coincidence. But yeah, so the qualities of net art. There's a German theorist, Tilman Baumgartel, who argued that the qualities of net art are connectivity, global reach, multimediality, immateriality, interactivity, and egality. But from my perspective, the big one of that list, the one that's most endemic to only this medium, is interactivity. Because, like, sure, sculptures and performance art pieces can be interactive, but interactive work in museums usually does involve technology. Like, I actually had the opportunity to work for the Museum of Contemporary Art right after I graduated college, starting in the summer. And I was hired as what was called like a gallery guide. Further, I was raised on the internet exhibit, and it was not like that nice of a job. I mean, it was great to work for that institution. They treated me fine, but it was kind of like their most entry level, most grunt work job, where basically the exhibit that they had, which was on net art in the summer 2018, they had 3 interactive works where I helped visitors interact with them. One piece, I couldn't find the name, but it was basically like this big conveyor belt where you take out the things in your pocket, like your wallet and your phone, and you put it on, and then it would take pictures of your belongings and collage them. It was a cool piece. And then the 2 others were like VR headset works, and one of them was Transdimensional Serpent by John Raffman, and the other was Phantom by Daniel Steegman Mengrain. But I think it's telling though that like this exhibit needed like this whole new job just for that exhibit, which was like helping people interact with the works that hadn't previously been created for any other exhibit at the MCA. Have you been to the MCA, by the way? Because you said you'd seen Factory of the Sun by Hito Sterl, and that's where I've seen it. But where did you get to see that work?
I got to see it at the Whitney Museum when I was one of the, I think, 200 artists that collaborated for Lorna Mills' work, The Ways of Something, where it was actually shown at it was called the Dreamlands Immersive Art and Cinema 2015. So basically it was a show, I think, back in 2015. And they had this big room with like a kind of a gridscape where they showed the film with like these lawn chairs you could sit on and watch. It was really cool. It was very immersive.
Yeah, when it was exhibited at the MCA, it also had like the grid and the lawn chairs too. What was it that you contributed to that Lorna Mills piece? Some sort of like digital asset?
Yeah, me and like other net artists, we all did 1 minute. We all picked 1 minute out of the 4 episodes of John Berger's Ways of Seeing. And we kept the audio, but we made our own video version of that. And so mine was the first minute of episode 2.
Yeah.
So
I actually am not familiar with that, with Ways of Seeing. What is it?
I think it's like a public, it's a public understanding of art and art history, kind of in like a fashion of similar to like a PBS special kind of thing.
Yeah.
So it's kind of cool. It allows people to kind of understand artwork through the lens of John Berger and his critique on art at the time. I think it was like in the 70s. There was a lot of critique on like, I think second wave feminism with art too. So like how we understand that. And I think that's why I picked episode 2, because it kind of covered that. So
yeah. And then this is so unrelated. I can't believe I'm bringing this up at this point, but I did just want to mention before we get into the works of a few net artists that I think that like something that shows how thoroughly our culture has been like permeated by net art and post-internet aesthetics is the popularity of Skibidi Toilet. Are you familiar with it a little
I
bit?
am aware. I have the internet brain rot of many, so I do partake in the viewership of the Skibidi Toilet and understand that it is originally started as a Gary's mod for a game called Half-Life 2, and that there's all these production companies and development companies creating high market video tools for professional video craftsmen, and there's also people who can modify a mod for a game to make their own videos and get more views than someone who spends millions of dollars. So that's
Yeah, I've never watched it myself. Maybe I've seen like a reel that got in my algorithm somehow, but the aesthetics of it, they kind of remind me a lot of Adult Swim and their aesthetics. And I mean, it's ironic that what I consider Adult Swim aesthetics for adults are now popular amongst children. And I've seen toys for them. Like I walked through a Target recently and I think I saw some there. So they're that big that they're like toys for kids even. But yeah.
Yeah, no, I'm not sure. Like, I'm pretty sure the intent of the person who made the Skibidi Toilet was just to put something online that's wacky, or their creations sort of this playing around in the sandbox thing. But it became its own entity, and such as the internet, it grew its own life outside of the original meaning, and now it's being sold and co-opted by probably capitalism. So.
Yeah. Now let's talk about a few of the net artists we like, and we're going to talk about 4 that you'd recommended. So the first one's Brad Tromel. So when did you first become familiar with him, and what do you like about him?
I think my partner referenced Brad Tromel a few times from the jogging, which I was familiar with the jogging and their kind of satirical takes on the art world that maybe didn't understand at the time. But I really like their commentary on things. I think I have his book Peer Pressure that I used a few times to the reference. He did talk about how sometimes art did change after like what 9/11 happened, and like the way that we portrayed our online selves. He did mention earlier too, I don't want to go off topic, but you mentioned that people would collage the things in their pockets, into things that made me think of like how in MySpace times people would grab everything they had and take a photo of it and put it on a bulletin board just to kind of like show off their wares and stuff. I always thought that was really fascinating and very, very MySpace era.
Yeah. And the MySpace era was when like the wallets that had like chains were popular.
Yes.
So people probably wanted to show those off too.
Yeah, for sure. But yeah, Brad Tromel, I love his commentary now when he does those art reports too. There's a lot to it. I think he did do a net art report too. I definitely recommend checking out his work though. He definitely does a critique, and sometimes his videos on Instagram are just showing off what he finds on TikTok, which is some of the most outlandish stuff I've ever seen. I'm like, I can't believe you're showing me this. I wasn't expecting to see this today, but this is the world we lived in. So I think that's a lot of his posts too. So where he's just kind of pointing out some things that go on, and there's some like hypocrisies and grifting that goes on. So
that is a good way to actually get traffic to your page, though, is if you find content that you think could go more viral, and then you post it, maybe you comment on it so that you can justify reposting it, but then that can just go viral on its own accord, and then people find your page that way.
Yeah, and I do like how he separates some of the stuff he shows versus the art world reports that he keeps on his Patreon, or he gives us little snippets of in his posts.
I wish he would number them though.
Yeah, yeah.
Which we do for our podcast, but like even just going through his Patreon, the number, like, it would just be helpful to know like how many videos he has, because it's hard to piece out all of the ones that are the actual cultural report videos. But anyway, small complaint. I do like him too a lot. I first found him through Instagram. I probably found him like at least 4 years ago. And in the years since, like he'll become viral for like random reasons and like re-renter the discourse at different times. But he originally became known for a Tumblr blog called The Jogging, which I didn't know about, but he launched it in 2009. And it was basically just a big collection of odd images that he co-curated by like a group of like about a half dozen people. And most of the images were like photoshopped to look kind of bizarre. And I looked through it a bit, and it kind of reminded me of how before there were memes, people used to just sort of share weird pictures online and with friends. Like I grew up in a household with 5 siblings, and when one of us would find like a weird picture online, we'd show each other to kind of like see like how much we could weird the other person out. Like I think a good example of this is the grainy picture of giant arthropods eating Doritos. I'll link that in the show notes, but when you see it'll ring a bell.
Yeah, I know that one.
Yeah. Do you remember that phase of the internet though? And like there were just those weird pictures before there were memes.
I think people still share that photo of the arthropods. It's still making its rounds. It's so good.
Yeah. Well, that's why that one comes to mind, because it does pop up occasionally, but most of the other ones don't. Like I know that's what we were doing, but it's hard to remember like what the pictures were at the time. Mm-hmm. As we mentioned earlier, Brad had like a pretty formal art career, and my favorite piece that he did when he was making like work that was meant to be displayed in galleries was a series he did called Army of Ants, which were like these basically anthills encased in glass that could be hung from the ceiling, and they had these really beautiful color gradients. And I think he like auctioned off one of them at one point, or it was like a gift to one of his Patreon subscribers or something. But that's probably my favorite piece I've seen by him. That's like a physical work.
Yeah, I think I remember seeing that, or at least a picture of it. But I think you did touch on his like monetization platform a little bit, where I think that's kind of cool how he also auctions his work off as sort of like, what was that, kind of a raffle kind of thing. But then he also does kind of a studio meetings too for all of his followers that are available. So I think that's kind of cool how the access to an artist now is being utilized through the internet. That's pretty cool.
Yeah. Have you ever spoken with him at all?
I tried to set up a meeting when I was in art school to kind of just touch base on like studio practice stuff, but schedules didn't meet up, so I just kind of missed. But yeah, I was part of the Patreon for that reason. So
yeah, I'm back on his Patreon again because I wanted to rewatch his culture reports for this week's episode. But yeah, it's interesting to look at his work because he actually did the same program I did at SAIC in Visual and Critical Studies, which it is an obscure degree. It is largely only offered at art schools. And then in the UK, the equivalent is called Cultural Studies. And so there's a reason why, like my podcast does cultural analysis and then Brad does culture reports. And there is a bit of similarity in the work that we do. Like, I mean, his is much more visual. They're video essays, and ours is a different format. But I think there's something similar that we're doing. Have you ever heard of Nymphet Alumni, the podcast?
Oh, no. It sounded similar to a musical artist, but no, I haven't.
Yeah, no, they're who our podcast, Silent Generation, is sort of modeled after in a way. But one of the girls on that podcast, Alexi, she also studied visual and critical studies. So people who are fans of all of us, there's a reason, there's a connecting thread. But yeah, and then the next artist we can talk about is Guido Sterl, who is a German filmmaker and art theorist who sort of has one foot in the physical art world and then another in the more academic / theoretical side of things. And she's one of the world's most prolific living artists. Like, she was declared the world's most influential artist in 2017 by our review Power 100. And she became famous at first around 2014 for Liquidity Inc., which is like a 30-minute video that's described as being I don't know if I've seen this word before, a beguiling post-economic crash parable of mixed martial arts, MMA fighting, high-frequency trading, weather systems, and the liquidity of markets, labor, and information. And it actually kind of has like a pseudo sea-punk aesthetic. I mean, not really, but it's aquatic. We'll give it to her though. But I've never seen this piece because most of her works, I mean, pretty much all of them, you can only see them in galleries and museums. And so I've only gotten to see one in person, Factory of the Sun, which we'll get to that in a moment. But I also got to see another piece called In Free Fall. And the reason why I got to see this is kind of contentious because I had a friend when I was at SAC who worked for an archive, and she actually she smuggled out a copy and we watched it at her house. And so that's how I got to see that one. But it's truly very hard to get to see Hito Sterile videos, which sucks because I'd watch them every day if I could almost. I feel like usually when people ask me who my favorite artist is, I say Hito Sterile.
Yeah. I have their book Duty Free Art where they like kind of talks about like proxy politics and is it the basically like the problem with fascism and tautology. There's lots of concepts that they kind of hammer down with just modern cultural critique. I mean, the fact that they can like put something like with video games nowadays where it's almost like the references of Metal Gear that they put in the Factory of the Sun and the use of gunshots and violence like with MMA, you know, they're touching on like some of the modern escapist tendencies of the breads and circuses that we see in culture, and I think that's kind of really great because it kind of catches your attention.
Yeah, I have that book too. I've read a few chapters, but I've never truly finished it. But
there's lots of parts that make sense.
Do you have like
because I know they do reference a lot of like emails and like things that like are like literally just almost photocopied like letters and such that I don't understand like why they're telling me this information. But yeah, but there are like a lot of fractured ideas in this thing, which is kind of great for my mindset because my mind goes a lot of places now too. I've been off Adderall for about 2 years now, so I'm learning to recap empathy and learning to like accept the world that I'm not hyper focused in. So,
yeah, I mean, I don't really remember too much of art in the age of planetary civil war, but there is one quote that sticks out to me where she basically said that we are trying to live an ever repeating present that we've constructed through borrowing from the future in order to sort of repeat the past. Very poetic, but I think it kind of describes our social fixation on nostalgia. But other than that, I don't remember too much, but we can talk a bit about Factory of the Sun now. So what was your take on it when you got to see it?
This is before I went to art school, so I didn't really know too much about maybe what was being shown, but you know, to give the talk about just art in general. But I liked that they incorporated 3D imagery and also this hyper like post production of like bullets and like bright colors and the light bulb that part, but then also the music and dancing. It's just always kept it interesting, but also it's hard to remember a lot of it too for because it was such a long time ago that I saw it, and I can't just go back to it because I remember seeing rips and stuff on YouTube, but there was no actual release online, so it's kind of hard to get a grasp on what I saw again. But I do know they did have references to like Metal Gear and video games, and then also the viral dancing sensation of some guy in a jumpsuit. So
the dancer takes some crime from YouTube.
Yes.
Yeah, he was like an early internet phenomenon, and his way of dancing just reads as very like early internet to me. It's been described as its own dance style called criming. And many of his early videos, they were like him dancing to electro swing songs, which that was also like a very early internet genre of music. But I had a friend actually who pretty serious artist, is getting his MFA now, but he didn't actually like Factory of the Sun just because of the inclusion of Take Some Crime, because apparently he liked him in middle school, and it was just like embarrassing for him to rewatch that. But apparently, like, Hito had a reason to include this internet dancer, and it was kind of coincidental. Like, one of her assistants, that was her assistant's brother, and in the video, the assistant who'd actually been speaking was also a character in Factory of the Sun. Like, she tells this story about how her parents or her family were Russian immigrants, and they packed up everything they could into a car and left, and then immigrated. And that was apparently like a real life biography. And I mentioned this quote actually on the podcast more than once, but Hito Sterl had said in reference to, why did she include this real life biography? Why did she include this personal connection? The brother of one of her assistants. And she'd said that it was because, like, real life biographies are more complex than anything she could ever imagine. And that's always stuck with me, because I think, yeah, if you meet the average person off the street and you actually learn everything about their life, it does seem even more complex than fiction. And if you were to write about their life in a fictional way, it would come off as being even more grandiose than, would be appropriate maybe for a novel. So that's always stuck with me. But I had a chance to watch that film like a dozen times, if not more, because, it was on display when I was working at the Museum of Contemporary Art. And I would get like hour-long breaks that were really nice. And so, like, I would just go up to watch Factory of the Sun when I had time. And I got to see the whole thing front to back a bunch of times. But I'll give like a brief description that I found through Mocha, just so people know what it's like. Ricocheting between genres, news footage, documentary film, video games, and internet dance videos, Factory of the Sun uses the motifs of light and acceleration to explore what possibilities are still available for collective resistance when surveilling has become a mundane part of an increasingly virtual world. Factory of the Sun tells the surreal story of workers whose forced moves in a motion capture studio are turned into artificial sunshine. And yeah, it's much more about like the mood, though, I'd say. Like, the plot gets lost. It's kind of absurd. It's not supposed to be I wouldn't say you're supposed to walk away and know what to do with your life. You're just supposed to, like, sort of reflect on the absurdity of late capitalism and the absurdity of the internet. And it's impactful, though. I loved watching that every time I got to see it.
Yeah, it seems like when you're like, or when they're dancing, it's like sometimes when we go to the internet, we enter that ludic dimension of just playfulness, and we want to, like, I wouldn't say like consumption has meaning sometimes, but maybe it does, and sometimes maybe it does next time. It's not necessarily it's not set in stone every time you watch it. And we do have, like, we're in, like, in a world where, like, we're always on everything and everyone has access to us. And I know that even in the duty free art section, they talk about, is the internet dead? Because if everyone has access to everything and it can be copied, then why not everything else? And so it's kind of like an understanding that, hey, some of the offline things are a conscious thing that we have access to, instead of, yeah. And so when we play a record versus, surf a Spotify algorithm, we're making that conscious effort, so.
Yeah. And I've actually been trying to, like, sort of intentionally consume more, like, instead of putting things on a playlist, being like, I want to listen to this song now, or just like shuffling through things. It's a different experience, I would say. And then I do want to bring up briefly one of her writings, because again, she's a studio artist. She has a lot of, like, really great videos, but she's also known for being a writer and a thinker. And her most famous article, I would say, is In Defense of the Poor Image.
Oh,
have you ever gotten to read that?
Yes, I did. It's really great. It's like, it's self-realizing.
Yeah. The piece sort of argues that low quality, often circulated digital images considered poor due to their degraded resolution and lack of pristine quality hold significant political and social value as they reflect the realities of the contemporary digital circulation. And so I actually see like memes reference the degradation of memes as they circulate as part of the meme. I bet you have too. You know, like sometimes you'll just see like really chaotic memes that have become so low quality and they're meant to be kind of confusing.
Yeah, deep fried.
Yeah, I like those personally. I because I do think that there is something sort of endearing to poor images. Like I'm going to put a link in the show notes to something. It's a screenshot I took of someone else's story. I kind of forget who, but I uploaded it to IamGur. But someone had said, I love when a meme comes back to me all cropped and effed up. It's like when a cat comes home covered in leaves. Like, what have you been up to since I last saw you? And the meme that they'd posted was like some sort of giant prehistoric arthropod next to some girl in a bikini.
That's so funny. When we look at like the low res image, I always think of like, okay, we have the institution of the high res, which is like the billboards you see out on a street corner, right? But then, you know, the low res image, like I've had like magazines sometimes hit me up for my art that I've made just for the internet. And they're always asking, hey, do you have a higher res version of this? I'm like, this is it. And it made me think of like the idea of like how, you know, a legit institution show that's on a main venue, you know, will have like a billboard that shows stuff versus the punk show who just wheat pasting stuff on things, you know. You know, it's almost like the low res image is that wheat paste image compared to the institution of billboards and such. So I always thought that was kind of cool to get the correlation between the two.
It is now possible though to enhance images to a higher resolution using AI. Like actually for the Silent Generation main artwork, which is me and Joseph next to a flag, we had enhanced that with AI for Apple Podcasts because it was originally a Polaroid. We scanned it. The scanner we used couldn't be that high quality, and then we had to enhance it with AI. It looks fine. I don't think most people would even notice, but those tools are available now, which is pretty cool.
Yeah, there's a whole world of now where someone's prompting an AI to make art too, and that's its own conversation. So,
yeah. And then the next artist we can talk about is Laturbo Avedon. This is someone that I know about, but actually I'm not as familiar with. Do you want to explain who they are a little bit?
Yeah, well, we now exist in a world where, you know, the artist could be an avatar. Even I know them from their artworks also on Second Life and being a little avatar on there. But yeah, I think they've made like very 3D hyperreal glitch art. But then also I remember seeing their art being used in a Samsung TV ad. I'm not sure if it was on purpose or not, or if they just found a random image. That was really cool though.
Yeah. So Laturbo Avedon is like Avatar, you know?
Yes.
And she's sort of to contemporary art what Hatsune Miku is to music. And the two have actually collaborated. And then another sort of like analogous project is the Gorillas, you know, although they're pre-virtual, but sort of similar idea where of course there's a human being behind the project, but the artists and the musical artists are treated as their own entity and taken seriously by institutions as such. I've never been on Second Life though. Were you pretty active on it?
Back in like 2012, yes. I just learned how to import models into there and then 3D model a space for the C-punk movement. So anyone who could come look at some of the fake pseudo designs and actually taught me a lot about like meshing my like t-shirt designs into 3D apparel that you can actually buy with their digital currency, which was pretty cool. But yeah, it was a good synth. It allowed me to kind of, for one, it was like a playground sandbox for like 3D modeling and setting up a digital space. So
yeah, because like that just reminded me, you know, you made designs for Mainframe, but there was another company where they made like ponchos, and then I think you might have made like a sea punk dress for them.
Yeah.
I kind of forget the name. I have a picture of it on my like sea
Ti-
punk slideshow I made in
Time
high
Fly.
school.
That was called Time Fly.
Oh yeah, Time Fly. Yeah. And yeah, I remember the dress, the image of it, the virtual woman wearing the dress. Like, was that in Second Life? The image that you'd made?
It's very possible it could have been in Second Life. But there was a hyper real
Yeah.
version that's on their site, which they did pretty much. So
Yeah. That's interesting though, because I'd actually never heard of that before. Every time, I mean, I've gotten to talk to both you and Chan now. Really amazing opportunities I never thought would happen. But yeah, I didn't know that there were sea punk environments in Second Life. So like, were those the same as say like in the music videos you'd made for Ultra Demon?
yeah, I tried to make them sort of similar. There was a specific kind of garden estate which had kind of these round platforms over basically you rent land in that area, and so you can set whatever mesh models to create the 3D environment. So I mean, they didn't span out for miles like you would see in some of the artworks, but it kind of gave gave the same motifs of using like, columns and repetition frieze patterns that you see in like some of the Greek architecture. Which the reason behind the frieze patterns generally is not necessarily that I wanted to reference Greek, architecture, as more or less it's the fact that that specific frieze pattern was a default like pattern you would see in Photoshop, so it is referencing the technology more than it is the culture. So
Yeah. I mean, I liked all the Greek references personally. I can't say the full term, but the Greek new media S word blog. Did you ever see that back in the day? They were like aggregating all of the like Tumblr images of Greco-Roman columns and busts and stuff like that.
no, I haven't.
But yeah, that's the term that I use though for like when I would see Greco-Roman references in Tumblr artwork from that period was Greek new media.
Okay, that's interesting.
Any other things you'd like to bring up about Le Turbo Abaddon?
No, I just know them as like one of the first kind of digital presences of identity that was like totally virtual, which I thought was really cool.
Yeah. They still look very like early 2010s to me because they're still making work, which I actually was a little bit surprised by. I thought that, I mean, I'm glad they are, but I don't know. I just assumed that they probably would have wound down by now and stopped putting out new things. But like their Instagram page, they have new pictures of La Turbo Abaddon, and they still have like the same sort of image quality and haircut that they did back in the day, which reads as very 2010s.
Oh,
Um,
yeah, and they
you can
did
go.
that Panther Modern, which was like kind of collaboration artists where they were running a virtual gallery even. And I think they did did they do something in Fortnite too? I think they were working with the creative. They were using Fortnite as like a Gary's Mod kind of situation.
Yeah, I think I read that too. But yeah, the final artist to talk about, this was the only one I had never heard of before this week, and that's Lorna Mills. And so you actually got to work with them. So how did you get to know Lorna?
I have no idea. I got an email, I think, from just like maybe it was just general email asking for like a call for net artists to work on this project, and I expressed interest, and I got like a document of the requirements, but I never actually met them in person until the actual show that was in 2015. And so at the time I was working with a lot of like 3D animation software and learning how to model. So what I do know is they did a lot of works with like Transfer Gallery, and because they kind of helped us link together a lot of net artists together, like at least some of the ones I knew. I don't know, like Claudia Hart and some other artists. Yeah, so I think we did meet them at the Whitney when they had that show, but I have no idea. I think it was just an email I got, and I think maybe they got information from my Tumblr works, and that's pretty much it.
I mean, it's a very cool collaboration. It seems like she's mostly known for GIFs. Would you say like that's her primary medium?
Oh yes, kind of like the isolated gifs that kind of definitely rides on the artifacting of like cutting out specific gifs and then recontextualizing them into like a space or even among other gifs. So like definitely relies on like it's definitely referential.
Her work, I wouldn't say is like the easiest to find online because I couldn't actually find like a web page, like a website for her. But I'm gonna put a link in the show notes to some of her gifts. There's a page that has like Triad, which is still, and Homesick Lover Girl, so people can take a look at them. There is like a really nice quality to them where they're layered and they move. They have a lot of movement in a way that I think would be difficult to do outside of GIFs, and that just like the number of directions they can move in at once would be really difficult to animate in any other way, I think. So yeah, again, there's a really nice quality to them.
I like when they show animals. I'm just gonna say that.
Yeah.
I like the playfulness of like some of the animal gifts. I think there's one in like Luna del Mile, and I think the Witch's Still was really good because there's cat eyes in it. So
Yeah. And then she does have an Instagram page, which I kind of feel bad saying this now because I didn't know that you had a personal connection, but I wanted to say that her Instagram page does make me think of Brad Tromel's repetition mindset artist of snowflakes post, or just his repetition mindset idea. Because her Instagram page is actually like she just posts like one GIF a day. Honestly, they're very simple and it does sort of follow Brad's repetition mindset idea. So I'm actually going to open up his post and read up what he wrote off of a few slides just so people get an idea of what this is, because I think it's a really helpful way to think about your own creative practice.
yeah, like they're posting something every day, so you're not sure if like this post is actually a work in itself, and then or if the whole entire page is its own thing. In which case, like the lines are kind of blurred in that respect. But like it's maybe that's the comment. Maybe that they're not using it to the expectations of. I know when there's a lot of influencers and such that will have coaches that say you need to post every day, and it's like, well, if they're posting every day, then why not make the work itself its own thing, or maybe respond to that being like, hey, I'm doing that, but it's not. I noticed that they make their whole post a rainbow in that respect. So
yeah, there's like a color gradient where they go between colors. Yeah.
like the cat.
But yeah, so what is the repetition mindset? So according to Brad Tromel, some people believe the purpose of making art is to endlessly drill down in specificity so that you develop a singular shtick, so everything you make becomes instantly recognizable by your unique stylistic signature. It's less mastering a craft than it is an informal copyright claim laid to specific materials and visuals. If you call dibs enough decades in a row, it's all yours. This is repetition mindset. Repetition mindset goes by different names. The artist's formal vocabulary or the artist's referential language come to mind as examples where painting the same thing 5 decades in a row is given the wildly exaggerated reverence of having invented an altogether new form of communication. Repetition mindset means existing in a hermetically sealed set of references to your own past work. You're no longer responding to the external world or to your peers in favor of making slow, steady alterations of your original recipe. So I like this idea a lot because most artists do this. I mean, even me when I was like a young artist starting in middle school and high school, I kind of felt the need to limit the scope of my ideas and limit the color scheme I was working with and the materials so that I could have some consistency between the pieces that I was making. Even though that period was probably supposed to be a bit more experimental, I did end up with a very good portfolio by the time I applied to art school. But yeah, it's kind of crazy that artists feel so much pressure to stick to one thing.
It's so true. There is a lot of pressure, right? Like, but I think that's where I run into this a lot. Obviously, when I feel like a lot of my TikTok videos are now just me just making a fish sing. Is this what people want? Because that's not what I want. And I think a lot of times when I was making like art as far as visual, I know a lot of musical artists run into this because sometimes you're listening to the same song over and over and you just got to step away. I know Ultra Demon referred to something as spending too much time in the monkey house because you don't know the smell of your own matter. So sometimes you got to step away from that. And I think ADHD really helps with that because honestly, if you get bored by something, you just stop doing it. So you just like move on to something else or, have a new experience. I think that's why I like a lot. I experimented with a lot of other mediums as far as, whether it be digital art or animation or even film production or photography. And just kind of all over the place and seeing what works. And maybe I won't master a specific subset of something, but maybe I will if it maintains a vibrant stimulation for my practice. So
Yeah, because I think your practice overall is a good example of why you shouldn't get into repetition mindset because you did develop an aesthetic that influenced C-punk and influenced vaporwave. And yeah, I mean, C-punk did wane in popularity, kind of ended, sadly, although maybe there could be a future. But, you could have laid claim, like Brad was saying, and have an informal copyright on this entire medium of art. But instead of doing that, you like chase new interests and you found you liked hacking animatronics like the Billy Bath fish. And you've taken a completely different approach where instead of like trying to take this idea for yourself and have it only be your own, you actually uploaded a YouTube video where you shared the Arduino code so people could make their own Billy Mouth bass. So you've taken a completely different approach. And I think it's paid off because, you got a little bit famous for creating C-punk artwork, but 1 million TikTok followers is huge. Like it's paid off that you didn't just try to stick to one thing.
yeah, that's great to hear. But yeah, I don't know what's next. I do see that there's a lot of cool. When people say like C-punk died, it's like it's interesting because I'm not sure where it died or how it does. I did buy one of those T-shirts that says C-punk is dead just because I wanted the novelty of it. You can find those like on the Amazon and such, but I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, now with your like the relaunch of Mainframe, I guess we'll see what happens. But like, do you see yourself continuing to make more like C-punk environments? Because in some of your videos that you posted to TikTok, there will be like a singing fish or a singing Furby, but then there will be like some of your old C-punk artwork included in the video in the background, which I really like. So yeah, I hope that you continue to do both because your artwork was already so nostalgic and I'm nostalgic for it now. And I'm sure that like other people would relate to it in today's world because it still has that sort of impact because it was aesthetic then, it's aesthetic now. It's not something you see every day. So there's still going to be resonance in today's environment. And I hope your relaunch goes well.
Yeah, I had a great time talking about this stuff with you. And if you have any other questions or about that, feel free to let me know.
Yeah, thank you. I'm very thankful I got to do this episode with you today. Again, it was a real honor.